All right, so this is once again notes towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And this is once again part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis towards Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And we have been adding in America, just for clarification, even though, as we pointed out, that's not part of David's original title for this, which is his 11th section of Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, and our part 12, because of our edition of the reading of the introduction of Michael Mersel's introduction to David's talk piece. And I had already begun, an initial version of this reading in which, I've had to delete it and begin again, or I could have left it, I suppose. But I had made this error, once again in describing where we're located in the reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David's reading and elaboration and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of Oedipus. And the error that I had made was, in describing what David Antin misses in the formal structure and organization of this comedy, The Smile of the Sphinx, that is the Othisi, Analepsi, and Anavasi, which I've argued provides a kind of formal, one could say formal and metaphorical, argument that relates to Aristophanes' conception of the divine feminine, and that is related to to various aspects of the plot and the unfolding of the plot, and the significance of symbols, as they relate, to the revealing of the unfolding of the plot, and once again, in describing the Othisi and Analepsi and Anavasi as a way of returning to where we left off, and what David may have failed to see or left out. I once again, made the mistake of reifying the relationship between these elements and the unfolding of the plot, and I once again, even though I've described my error and attempted a kind of phenomenological explanation of the error in terms of the way that mind overgeneralizes and mind simplifies, right? There's a tendency, there's a movement of mind, toward overgeneralization of pattern, and that can have all kinds of deleterious, psychological effects if it's attached to the mechanics of aggression or narcissism or projection, right? And what I'm referring to are all the isms, racisms, and bigotries, and other forms of malignant overgeneralization that affect consciousness, not only at the individual level but at the collective level, right? And that relates to our discussion of fascism, so that's interesting. But also, it just pushes, individual subjects and sometimes, collectivities and communalities and cultures in this direction of, simplification and error, right? And my mistake, was more along, those lines, somewhat harmless in terms of all of that. Oh, and I forgot to mention that we also hinted at ways that, unconscious desires or fears, right, whether one wants to find a continuum, between, desire and anxiety, or see those as two separate psychological functions, either way, that also might account for some of the ways that reifications and simplifications are made. And so once again, even though right, I caught my error earlier and provided an explanation for it, and even attempted to find some kind of like psychological explanation of why such errors are made. I once again made it at the outset of the introduction to this piece, and I described the fact that the character of Tiresias is largely the central figure in Act 1, which is true. But then I also described this formal organization of the Othisi, Analipsi, and Anavasi, in which I claimed that Act 1, 2, and 3 provide these three elements in relationship to Tiresias. And as we pointed out, when I had to dig out my copy of The Smile of the Sphinx, from its location in a packing box, and that was a considerable amount of work, but there's something in my unconscious nagging at me, saying something about the error and pointing me to that's not quite right, and the hint, right, that it wasn't quite right. And then having looked it up again, we determined that in fact the Anavasi for Tiresias occurs in Act 1, Scene 1 of The Smile of the Sphinx, and not in Scene 3, not in Act 1, Scene 3, as I had initially described it, and as I had described it in beginning the piece that that I wish to construct and share and offer today, and which we've had to delete and begin over. And I suppose one could say more about the desire to simplify and overgeneralize and to imagine these one-to-one correspondences between whatever it is, whether it's elements of an unfolding of an action and the way that a plot is actually organized, which produces this false idea, or reification of the idea of linear narrative, when in fact narrative is never linear, or whatever it is that that these reifications and simplifications and overgeneralizations result in. But I won't discuss that much further, other than to point out that they're relevant. The errors themselves become relevant demonstrations that bear upon some of the important premises that we begin with in this series, that is, after all, titled Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology. And one of the assumptions, the generative assumptions for constructing a metapoetics of paranarratology is to challenge the idea that that narrative can be linear in any way, shape or form, whatsoever. And recently, in a different piece, we went in search of Peggy Guggenheim and attempted to look for Peggy Guggenheim according to a schema or a schemata or a schematics of a bijective function between, and I won't entirely reveal what that bijective function or one-to-one correspondence is, but the map, the schematic, the diagram for the search, for Peggy Guggenheim was attempted, right, to unfold in this one-to-one correspondence sort of manner, and the result, I think, effectively, self demonstrates that both in real life, if one imagines that there is such a thing, and in fiction, our plots and our stories, never unfold in the way that these oversimplifications and over generalizations, might imagine them to unfold, linearly as a sequence of causally, related events and phenomenon, right? So, that error having been made and now explained, here, and deleted, although, if we wanted to offer, evidence of it, we could retrieve it at this point, perhaps, not tomorrow or the next day, and perhaps it won't matter. But let's say that we are at the outset of David's, recounting and elaboration and interpretation of Act 1, Scene 1, and I had also mentioned that this is Act 2 now and Scene 1, so made another error, but that's a different kind of error. That's an entirely different kind of error that is not based in this overgeneralization and reification of the aCiPhitTh, analepsy, and anavasi. But we are at the outset of his reading, recounting, elaboration, and interpretation of Act 2, Scene 1, and we've mentioned that Act 2, for the most part, belongs to Laius, and under the schema, under that three-part schema, aCiPhitTh, analepsy, and anavasi, the aCiPhitTh and analepsy, for Laius, are, one could argue, remain relatively intact as a structural formation in Act 2. But then, what happens in what happens in Scene 3 in Act 2, for Laius, can hardly really be described as an anavasi, and it should be described, in other terms. And so, one could say that, we still want to retain this idea that the structure exists, but perhaps it exists, for some characters, more than for others, and perhaps, the model, coheres to those characters that in one way or another embody, the idea or the conception of the sacred feminine, or the sacred, hermaphroditic, and as the characters fall away from that conception, their relationship to the aCiPhitTh, analepsy, and anavasi, perhaps, recede into the background, and as a sort of, patriarchal representation of this, tyrannical, fascism and malignancy that characterizes Laius, both his history prior to the unfolding of these events, and what and the part that he plays here, perhaps he in a certain way is denied the completion, right, the perfection, the telaiasis of this formal structure, this three-part structure, othisi, analepsy, and anabasi, and to some extent, you know, Oedipus is as well. And so that aspect, right, of the work that we've argued and continue to argue, you know, is an important part of the smile of the Sphinx. You know, nevertheless, is only fully realized, perhaps, you know, for the two characters of Tiresias and of Diarmenia Sheshapunk, that is, you know, the Sphinx. And something else, you know, perhaps, you know, we can say happens for the character of Laius in Act 1, in Act 2, Scene 3, and we'll, you know, perhaps elaborate more concerning that when we reach that point or that destination. So David begins, you know, narrating and explaining and interpreting Act 2, Scene 1, and describes that, you know, once again the stage is split into two parts, and once again these two parts, you know, bear similarities to the idea of a split screen in cinema, and on one side, we see Laius accompanied by another figure in a chariot, and this chariot is driving forward, but, you know, as in the other scenes in which motion is represented on these stage shots, David Antin says that the chariot's not really going anywhere, but the wheels are spinning dramatically, and a lot of rumble is made, you know, and there's a lot of, you know, noise coming from somewhere, you know, behind the stage set, and there's this unfolding landscape, and it begins in a kind of inferno or realm of shadows and flame, you know, that perhaps and there are some lights, you know, produced, you know, perhaps by you know, torches that illuminate, you know, his journey, and we seem to be, you know, David says, according to the unfolding of this stage set, you know, somewhere in perhaps in the underworld, you know, which is you know, resided over, you know, by the Greek god Hades, and you know, some level or sphere or circle in disk, perhaps, or somewhere else in this fiery, shadowy, you know, underworld, and as the backdrop on this side of the split, you know, stage unfolds, and we seem to be, you know, rising out of this place and on our way to Thebes. And on the other side of the set, David, you know, points out, you know, I forgot that he mentions that in the chariot, you know, with Laius is another figure. He's little beyond middle-aged. He's balding, thin, a bit scruffy looking. He squints. He seems a bit confused and perhaps absent-minded, and he's wearing a T-shirt, that David describes the T-shirt, and it says which way to the tripleus amoxitois, and question mark, and but you can't see the entirety of what it says on the T-shirt. It's only as he moves around and positions himself and looks. He's constantly. David says this character that is in the chariot, with Laius, is constantly looking around. Apparently, looking around for the tripleus amoxitois. That his T-shirt, reveals to us that he's, searching for, and in moving around and putting himself in these different positions, David says that we piece together the question, right? The question on the T-shirt, that we see little bits of it, and it unfolds to us like the way that a plot unfolds to us as we encounter it in these bits and pieces. So if we ignore him, we never, if we ignore this figure entirely, we never really get the question. David says that it's represented on the T-shirt. But if we pay attention to his comical routine, which is searching, sort of trying to crawl out of the chariot occasionally, or almost falling out of the chariot, he says, and all these movements on the part of this character, whose name David points out isn't revealed to us until later in the course of the dialogue in this act 2, scene 1, between Laius and Laius, and we'll get there. David says. So he's writing through this figure in his T-shirt and the question, and already we have the reification, because the audience and at this point hasn't put together the elements of the question, which way to the tripleus amoxitois, and that all has to be organized and constructed over the course of this scene, in which this character whose name David doesn't reveal here, and we'll follow David and not do the spoiler for that. And then on the other side of the set, you have the other Laius, and that Laius is wearing a crown and sitting on his throne, and so we're familiar with this one. And David says, ideally, again, if one had an acting troupe, that had a number of twins, one would want to use a twin, to play, whether that's possible or not, is another issue. But one would, if possible, one would want a set of twins playing the character of Laius, and then the backdrops once again meet up, and at that point where they meet up, and there seems to be a continuity, which David points out as a kind of illusion, as we recognize as a part of the apparatus that we're watching, and aware of it as illusion and representation, but also aware of what it signifies, and what it signifies when the continuity is established between the two backdrops. And so Laius driving in his chariot meets with himself as king, and David says, you can see now that the Laius in the chariot, appears to be slightly older, not necessarily wiser. And then David laughs, but slightly older and more disheveled, and perhaps more beaten down and bedraggled than that Laius, who sits upon the throne. And at the moment in which they meet, the Laius, who's on the throne, makes reference to Morpheus. So David says the Laius with the crown, says to the Laius in the chariot with this strange character wearing the T-shirt, which way to the Troipleus amoxitoas, this disheveled, companion, unshaven, slightly underfed and apparently confused companion that rides alongside of this second Laius, says to this second Laius, so who has sent me to myself? Who of the daughter? He says, who of the sons of sleep, have sent me to myself? And he's referring to Somnus, the Greek embodiment, allegorical figuration of sleep. There's also this and one of the pre-Olympian ancient archetypes, from which these 1,000 forms, or some say 1,001. David explains that his address to himself makes reference to somnus, sleep, and the 1,000 or 1,001 sons of sleep, and that he continues, who is it, who of the sons of Somnus has sent me to myself? And then he begins iterating, listing, like those long lists in the Iliad, David says, of who killed who, and you just can't wait to be done with this passage, because it's burdensome and tiresome to read, because it's one name after another, and this one killed this one, and this one killed this one, and these, it's like those passages in Numbers, the book of Numbers, David says, where you just can't wait to get finished with this apparently, non-narrative, in the sense of it's not moving forward. It's not moving. It's not moving us forward in the plot, right, and the unfolding of our story. It's just this long list of who got killed by whom, and they have no place in the story anymore, at least, and particularly if you're not a Greek, David says, and you don't know their backgrounds, and so they're just names to you, right, and you don't know their genealogies or what they might represent symbolically, or and so these like iterations of these long lists of names, he shakes his head, it's just tedious, and don't drive the story, either in terms of the development of the characters, as my idea of narrative represents, or the sequence of events that represent plot. They don't drive them forward, and so you just can hardly wait to get out of this. And then what Aristophanes does here, David says, is very comical, because he's asking himself, he says, like, which one of the sons of sleep, which one of the 1,000 or 1,001 sons of sleep are, sent me to myself? And then he starts listing, all of these, 1,000 or 1,001 sons of sleep. And he says, was it Morpheus? But he says, if you're a Greek, you don't hear Morpheus, you hear the fashioner, right? And so all of these, sons of sleep, all these sons of Somnus, have names that mean something, right? And so he he mentions Phobator, the frightener, right? And you know, the one who takes the form of a beast or a bird or a serpent, and he mentions Phantasos. But I think he refers to him as Phantasmos. Like Laius gets his name wrong. It's Phantasos, but Laius says Phantasmos, and then that gets a laugh out of the audience. But you know, that's fantasy, right? And you know, the one whose deceptive forms, you know, take the shapes of earth and rocks and water and trees and all types of lifeless things, and he goes on, and it's one after another, David says, and he gets you know about to 101, you know, David says, and we know that we've got, you know, 900 more names to go, and at that point, that, you know, and he mentions and there are more mistakes that he makes, right? Like he confuses you know, Isilos, you know, you know, Isilos is another, David points out, Isilos is another name for Phobator, right, the frightener, and but he confuses this one with Phantasos, whom, you know, he refers to as Phantasmos. So there's all these errors that he's making as he proceeds, like with these names, and he's getting them all wrong, but he just keeps, you know, plodding forward. You know, he's not correcting his errors or making, you know, or he doesn't seem to be aware of them, right? And you know, and while he's doing this, and even though, right, we're aware, if you're a close reader, David says, if you're a close reader of the story, you'll realize that the background as it's now represented, you know, on the stage, you know, in the continuity between the left side and the right side, whichever side the king and the charioteer are on, doesn't really much matter. David, you know, mentions, and it says, and we've already talked about why that is, so we're not going to talk about it again. But this background, right? It's precisely the background that we've seen before, you know, in those moments in which Oedipus and Laius, you know, confront one another in this struggle, in this dance, in which they, you know, position themselves in all of these geometric patterns, and that ultimately, you know, end with the death of either one or the other of the characters. So we know where we are. We're at the Tripleus Amoxitois, right? And so it's really funny that this character in the chariot, the companion to Laius, is still looking around at and not really. It doesn't seem to be paying, you know, too much attention to the dialogue that unfolds, you know, between Laius and Laius, and doesn't seem to be, you know, too concerned one way or another about the reiteration of all of these names of the sons of Somnus, the sons of sleep, you know, and the question, you know, which one of them, you know, sent me to you. And then David says, and he says, and you could count them if you wanted to. And he says, I've never, and then David laughs. And so we're a little bit off because you can see that he's not laughing here. He says, but something like with the expression that he has on his face right now. And I've never actually attempted, you know, to count, you know, all of the, I've never actually counted all of the names of all of the, and he puts of all of the sons of sleep that Laius reiterates here, and then he starts to smile. But it's got to be something like about around 100 or 101 names, and it's not driving the plot forward, and it's like one of these long lists that you get in the Iliad, you know, the Homer's Iliad, and so you feel like, in a way, you're stepping out of the constraints of comedy or drama, and that you've entered some different, you know, rhetorical domain, and that's funny too. It's because it's like this actor, this character, doesn't realize that there are constraints, like, you know, right, and rules, you know, provided, or if you don't like the idea of there being a rule or a constraint, you know, right, it's it's a certain kind of convention that that we understand that in comedy and in tragedy, right? Even the material of the dialogue is intended, to drive us forward, in terms of the unfolding of the plot and the action and the story. And if it doesn't do this, and it can do this in ways that are, humorous, and it can do this in ways that confuse, right, the relationships between the characters and the actions they've performed and then the stories. But under rare instances, and he says, Shakespeare was really terrific at opening up these potentials, that eventually, he says, we associate this with the musical, right? You could see, and then he kind of digresses into the character of Hamlet and Hamlet's soliloquies, and he attempts to argue that and we won't really follow him here, too much, but we'll just mention that in this digression, David attempts to argue that Hamlet's soliloquies are kind of like early inceptions of the musical, right? And these musical numbers that don't really assist the development of the plot, but provide us with this kind of little intermission of thematic and thematic material and pleasurable, right? Pleasurable action and activity and synchrony that doesn't move us forward, but that perhaps give us an emotional space, right, within the unfolding of the action that relates, to different kind of, set of pleasures, perhaps more libidinal, David suggests, than the cognitively relevant, functioning of the unfolding of the meaning of the plot and the narrative. And okay, so he gets into that, and we won't really follow him too much there, but we'll return, to where he is in the unfolding of this meeting, between Laius and this figure, of another Laius who seems to be, slightly older than the Laius on the throne, and David says, so at about this place, as we approach, 100 or 101 of these, different names of the sons of sleep, and who it might be that sent Laius to Laius, the Laius on the Laius in the chariot, he says, he says, well, use your head, he says, can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt? David says, the Laius in the chariot, says to the Laius on the throne, look, can I interrupt you? Use your head. You're the king. Who do you think? And the Laius on the throne, stops his reiteration of all these names. He scratches his head and he says, oh, and David says, of course, what he's referring to is, he's referring to the fact that it's Morpheus, who is generally Morpheus, that is the fashioner, who is generally associated with the dreams of kings, right? And so if the Laius on the throne, would just have used his head and recognized the fact that he's the king of Thebes, as we recognize, from the fact that he's wearing the crown, right, on his head, that he wouldn't have needed to recite this long list, because it would have been obvious to him from the outset that the son, right, that sleep would have chosen to send to him as king would have been, in fact, Morpheus, the fashioner. So, so David points out that the way that the way that the Laius in the chariot, begins to correct, and interrupt the Laius on the throne and point out to him, that he's just not using his head, is he also, makes this long, reiterative list of these incidents that a Greek, David says, would be familiar with, and it's kind of funny because he's interrupting this tedious iteration with an even more tedious iteration, and so the Laius in the chariot, asked the Laius, on the throne, well, he says, use your head. Who of the 1,001 sons of Somnus? Who of the 1,001 sons of sleep? David says, did were sent to Abbas? Who of the 1,001 sons of sleep? Were sent to Akmon? Who of the 1,001 sons of sleep were sent to Acrisius? Who of the 1,001 sons of sleep, were sent to Actius? And David says, and who is let's just do a couple more. Who of the 1,001 sons of sleep, were sent to Actor? Who of the 1,001 sons of sleep were sent to Admetus, of Pheriae? And who of the 1,001, sons of sleep were sent to Adrastus? Who of the 1,000, and it goes on and on. David says, who of the 1,001 sons of sleep, were sent to Aegeus, and he doesn't, stop. David points out until he gets to Agamemnon, and at that point, the Laius on the throne interrupts him and says, "Okay, I get it." And this is, David says, this is a long list of kings, right? This is a long list of kings, all of whom this deity sleep, or this archetype, or this allegorical figure of sleep, Somnus, sent Morpheus to reveal these dreams, or to reveal these narratives, really, that these dreams embody, right? And these domains of deception, that were sent to these kings, were all sent, via this figure of Morpheus, the fashioner, right? The fashioner, and in that sense, the fashioner is like, symphonia, the symphonia of the story that the dream represents, right? And all of that's in the fashioner's name. All of that's in Morpheus's name, and this long list, this long alphabetical list, that slows us down, right? That slows us down, in the movement forward of the story, in some way, like it lacks, like, all of the technique, right, that one would associate, with the fashioner, with the symphonia, and the tedium of it, David says, is extraordinarily comical. And he says, when in this second part, right, of the reiteration that is itself an interruption of the iteration of these names of the sons of sleep, with these names of kings that received this single son of sleep, Morpheus. Morpheus is the answer, right, to each one of these questions. Who was sent to Abbas? Well, the answer is Morpheus. Who was sent to Caucus? Well, the answer is Morpheus. Who was sent to Accessimus? Accessimenus. David gets the name right. I'm having trouble remembering all these names of Greek kings, but who was sent to Acmon? David gets all of these names right. Acrisius, he gets that one right. Actius, he gets that one right. Actor, Adamentus, he gets all these. Adrastus, he gets all these names right. And I can't remember them. Aegeus, some of them I can remember, some of them I can't. Certainly, I can remember Agamemnon, but that's an easy one. But David gets through, probably a longer list than I get through in recounting all of this. But in any case, he points out that the audience, knows the answer, to each one of these questions, and it's the same answer, right? It's the answer is Morpheus, the fashioner, and it's funny because the fashioner is so, the idea of a fashioner is so, diametrically contrary, to this long list of simple questions, like that all have the same answer, and it's funny, and the audience often participates in this humor, David says, and they'll call out at the end of each one, well, who of the 1,001 sons of Somnus, was sent to Abbas? And they'll say Morpheus, and who of the 1,001 sons of Somnus was sent to Akakis? And they'll say Morpheus. And who of the 1,001 sons, was sent to Aeetes? And and the audience, he says, will shout out, Morpheus. And by the time that they get to, generally, David says, by the time that they get to Agamemnon, then the Orpheus. My mistake. David doesn't make that mistake. The Laius, on the throne, will say, "Oh, I get it. Okay. So Morpheus. So I get it. The fashioner sent me to me, right? The fashioner sent myself to myself. I get it. So what do you have to say?" And he says, and who is that ridiculous looking figure in your chariot? And the Laius, that's in the chariot, looks at this awkward, character who hasn't been named, but who's all, distracting us, throughout this entire scene. It's like maddeningly looking for the tripleus amoxitois, which even a child could figure out that they've arrived at, right? Putting together. From memory, what the stage backgrounds looked like in those scenes in which the dream was narrated by Tiresias in those various encounters between Oedipus and Laius. So we know exactly where we are, and the only one who doesn't seem to know where we are is, of course, this character whose teacher says which way the tripleus amoxitois, and so the Laius on the throne says, well, what do you have to say? And who is this ridiculous-looking character, in the chariot with you? And the Laius in the chariot says, well, this is Kolemos, and if you're a Greek, David says, and you know who Kolemos is, and this gets a laugh. Because basically, Kolemos, David says, is the spirit of stupidity or ignorance or foolishness, and so the spirit of foolishness, Kolemos, is Laius, and he says, and at this point, David introduces, identifies this second Laius in the chariot as who he is. He's a ghost. He says the spirit of Laius, from the future, this future spirit of Laius, after Laius hasn't confronted Oedipus yet, David, and so David is explaining, the narrative here, and in some ways, reifying and simplifying the narrative. But he says, Laius hasn't encountered Oedipus yet, right? But he will. And the spirit that occurs, that is presented, right, to Laius in this dream that was sent by, Morpheus, the fashioner, right? He says, in this dream, this is the future spirit, the future ghost of Laius to himself. So Laius, the figure in the chariot, is already dead, or he's a spirit of the underworld. He's a spirit of the future. He's like, and David says, he's like in that Dickens story, right? That Dickens story, Christmas Carol, where this character Ebenezer Scrooge, right, is confronted by these three ghosts or three spirits of Christmas, and one is the spirit of Christmas past, and one is the spirit of Christmas present, and one is the spirit of Christmas future. And he says this Laius is like that spirit of Christmas future, but it's not Christmas, and it's his own spirit. Right, so it's the spirit of Laius's future, right? And so he already knows. He already knows the story of his own destruction and his own demise, and how he got there, and the story of his encounter with Oedipus at the tripleus amoxitois. But he says, but where we're going with this, and where Aristophanes is going with this, is this is it becomes complicated. He says it becomes complicated here. because, and he said, but let's leave that. Let's leave that and let that unfold the way that it unfolds. He says, and let's return, to this question, and who is that ridiculous? Why are you here? And who is that ridiculous character that you have as your companion in your chariot? And he says, well, this is kalemos. This is, and a Greek would understand. This is the spirit of stupidity, and it's my job, And then this is how we learn, that he's the spirit of that where he's located in the underworld. And it's my job, to teach him, how to drive a chariot. And King Laius on the throne rolls his eyes and he says, oh. And if you know the story, and David explains it, in more detail than we will here, but he says if you know the story, you'll understand why. You'll understand why Laius was condemned, to the underworld, he says, just like Sisyphus, was assigned this stone that he had to roll up a hill and it would roll back down. Well, he's assigned this task of attempting to treat this unteachable student, right? How to master and drive a chariot, and and part of the punishment, is that he has to put up with this guy and his annoying T-shirts, like that continually, remind in multiple ways, David says, but remind Laius, right, of all of these mistakes that he made, like this statement that's on this one that says, which way to the Troy Playas homoxitoas, that really, like if you think about Laius' story, this is like a really agitating, question, right? And so Laius is haunted, in these multiple ways, by this tormenting, figure of kalemos, who also reminds Laius of his own folly and stupidity, but Laius, might be incapable of recognizing some of that folly and stupidity because of his extraordinary investment in himself, and the profundity of his narcissism and his inability, right, to feel compassion and empathy, for anyone other than himself. And David, talks about, some of the past, Laius's past, that this figure of kalemos and this and this eternal damnation of teaching, this distracted older bumbling David says you can't even really call him a student. You can't even really call him a student because he's incapable of attending. And yet this is the assignment. And just like Sisyphus, he doesn't have a choice. He can't say well, this rock is just gonna roll back down the hill. I'm not gonna do it. He has no choice. He has to attempt to teach this older idiot, how to drive a chariot, and it's an impossible task. And it's not only is it an impossible task, but it reminds Laius of the entire history of his past mistakes. And all those aspects of himself that he'd rather forget about, right? And so David, makes a point of like how all of this stuff, like a Greek would have understood, like having access to the mythology, the mythos logos, and understanding all the connections between all the parts of the story. a Greek would get this. And like today, like if you presented it on stage, you might need, some kind of, elaboration, like, or inform your audience that in order to really get this play, you might have to do some background reading. David thinks it's kind of funny, but it bears upon the fact that, like these are the materials, with which the playwright is working, and the narratives are already familiar. So you're not working with, a narrative like that nobody knows, and the telling, is an initial, right, inventiveness, right? It's rather the way it gets told that's the inventiveness, because it's drawing upon like this ready-made material. All the material, like it has a lot of background, right? No one just has a name. Like no one's just named Mary, or three Marys. Like if you're Phobator, the frightener, like that makes a difference, from whether you're Somnus or Phantasos, that whose name, right, gets erroneously transformed into Phantasmos, and that in itself is funny. So you and if your name was Mary, but it got transformed into Maria, and he shrugs his shoulders there, like it might not be so funny, So all of that material, right, like is there, and it's there, as the scaffolding, through which Greek at this time, experiences the unfolding of the story itself, and we may not really understand that, today, but imagine that that there's a story, in our culture that's very familiar, and this story gets made into a movie. Well, that's more like the way that a Greek would have experienced this kind of stage and this kind of theater, and in that sense, he says it's very different, from the way that some of these, unique and not necessarily unique, because certainly there's an aspect, right? There's an aspect of your Orestes in Hamlet, right? Or there's an aspect, of there's an aspect of Antigone, perhaps in elements of King Lear, but he says, but in a certain way, if not entirely original, the stories and the narratives in Shakespeare, didn't belong, to a prescribed, set and domain, as did the elements in the Mythos Logos, and so when Laius, in the chariot says this is Kalemos, everybody laughs. They laugh just because of his name, and their understanding of who he is, and how he's incapable of learning. And then when he says, and it's my job, to teach him how to drive, a chariot, then the Greeks, they get the contrapasso, right? They get the contrapasso. We might miss the contrapasso here, but they get the contrapasso because they know the stories behind it, David says, right? And so they get, the discomfort of the Laius on the throne, as all of this stuff is revealed to him, right? They're getting, like, he's like shifting on his throne, he's shifting in his seat, he's expressing, visible, signs of anxiety and discomfort, and the audience gets it all because they understand the stories and they understand the significance of all the characters. So David says, so Laius in the chariot says, so this is Kalemos, and it's my job to teach him how to drive a chariot, and this is where I'm from. He says, but to answer your second question, which is why I'm here, it's to tell you how to defeat. It's to tell you how to defeat Oedipus at the crossroads. And Laius says, Oedipus? And who's Oedipus? And then that gets a laugh, obviously, from the audience. And the Laius in the chariot, has to explain the whole story to Laius, and Laius, is a little bit confused and confounded by all of this, and his jaw, hangs open, and his mouth is agape as the Laius in the chariot, reveals all of this to him, and he says, the Laius on the throne, following this lengthy narrative, revealed, by the Laius in the chariot, says, I was informed by Tiresias that I'm not supposed to go to the Tripleus and aCiPhitTh. And then this is a funny moment, David says, because as soon as he says Tripleus and aCiPhitTh, then Kolamos, right, like perks up, and his eyes get really, really big and wide, and he gets excited because there may be a clue, as to where to find the Tripleus and aCiPhitTh. Okay, so he says, but Tiresias, this is the Laius on the throne. He says, but Tiresias, they, and David says but he said, we'll say they told me, not to encounter, the stranger at the Tripleus and aCiPhitTh on the road, because he's going to defeat me. And David says, now, and this is where it becomes interesting, and this is perhaps where it relates, to our future, Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, in America, and he says, so first of all, you have to understand the profundity of the narcissism of this character, this figure Laius, and the profundity of the malignancy and the lack of empathy of this character and figure, and the profundity of his own tyranny, and perhaps that he says it's in his narcissism that lies the clue, and to how we can interpret and understand the rhetorical acts of deception made on the part of Tiresias. He says, because it appears that Tiresias is informing the King Laius, of how to defeat Oedipus and survive, right? How to survive, the riddles of the Sphinx, and in fact, Tiresias' intention is quite the contrary. And how does he know that providing Laius, like with how does Tiresias know? He says that if he tells King Laius not to go to the Tripleus and aCiPhitTh, Daulis toward Delphi, and encounter the stranger on the road who will be king, how does he know that King Laius will do just the opposite? In what way does his reverse psychology work? And what understanding does he have to have of the psychological structure that belongs to Laius to implement this strategy? How does he know that the future dead Laius, how does he know that, David says, does Tiresias know that the future dead Laius will return to Laius? And even after being defeated, will claim, that he wasn't defeated, or that the Oedipus cheated at the crossroads? Like, what manner of psychological subject, like even being defeated, like to the point of death, would return as a spirit and tell himself that he never lost? He says, well, there's a tyrant like this that emerges in this period, from 2016 to 2024. And not only, he said, David says, not only does Donald Trump, become president of the United States, in 2017, following the 2016 election, but then after he's defeated, refuses to admit defeat because of this, like the grandiosity and the insanity of the vastness of the psychological structure of narcissism, coupled with this basically, fascist masculine, malignancy. He says, and this refusal, right? A refusal, like following the general election, in which he loses, both the popular vote and the electoral vote, David says, but refuses to concede and will use any excuse possible. And then in December of 2022, when he announces his candidacy, for his intentions to run for president, in the 2024 elections, in 2 years, in the period, that follows, in that election that follows in 2024. In an election that he shouldn't even be legitimately allowed to run because he's already committed crimes against the Constitution, and it's in part of the oath that he takes. Then he's part of the oath that you take as president is that you commit yourself to upholding the Constitution. And not only did he fail to uphold the Constitution and attempt to incite an insurrection on January 6th of 2021, David says, but in addition to all of that, right, and after his declaration to run for president in 2024, this was made in December of 2022, David says, right after that, he came up with the most ridiculous excuse for throwing out the Constitution altogether and claiming that, he didn't even need to run for president because he's already president. And it had something to do with some ridiculous story about some laptop and his relationship to some Twitter flunkies. He says, he has to go, David, using future memory, has to go back and explain what Twitter is and who Elon Musk is to all of these listeners that are listening to this piece in October 15, 2003. But, and that's a long digression that we don't have to go into because we're not using a significant amount of future memory in the same way that David is. But he has to explain all of that and the ridiculousness of the justification, that this delusional, self-deluding subject has. Because why? Because he can't accept any idea of his own failure. And his narcissism is so extreme that he can't admit, any error or failure. And always has to project, right, that it's some kind of conspiracy or the result of some malevolent force, from the outside. And the solution sets, that he comes up with, David says, to get around like the truth, right, the aletheia, or the actuality, like the material world, like belong to the most ludicrous dimensions of delusion that one could possibly imagine. Like this idea that, because there may or may not be something on somebody's laptop, who didn't even run for president, the uncle of somebody's twin, twice removed cousin by marriage. But in this case, it happens to be the son of the president, and the focus there is on some imaginary laptop with some imaginary set of data, never mind where your reality is. And the excuse now is that because there might be an imaginary laptop with imaginary data, we can throw out the entirety of the Constitution and make Donald Trump president again. And the connections don't even make any sense. Whatever this guy did has nothing to do with the results of the 2020 election, right? Nothing whatsoever. And you can't go back and change the historical facts. But he says, but this is the level, of the destruction of democracy and the absurdity, right, of self-delusion that we're facing, in an actual person. Never mind the fiction, never mind the mythos, logos, and Laius and all of that. But Laius, just like this guy, is so self-deluded, that he'll fashion anything, in his mind, to maintain power and maintain his tyranny. And he thinks he can go back. He thinks he can go back and change the past. And maybe this, future ghost, thinks that he can elude and evade, his own condition as he exists in the future, in the same way that Oedipus imagines that he can, get around the fate that was foretold him. But it's even more ridiculous, he says, for Laius, at least for the ghost of Laius, because the ghost of Laius had already happened. For Oedipus, at least, it's only going to happen. But for Laius, it already did happen. It's like Trump going back and changing the results of the election. It's insane. It's utterly insane. But this is what he thinks he can do, right? So you have to understand that level of narcissism. So this is what's motivating Laius as he returns. To his past self, his past self before he makes this encounter. He says, forget Tiresias. He says, Tiresias is full of shit. That's what he says. He says, Tiresias is full of shit. Don't listen to Tiresias. Tiresias is fake news. That's what he says. Tiresias is fucking fake news. Don't listen to Tiresias. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want because you're the king. If you weren't supposed to be king, you wouldn't have this royal background and the prophetesses at Delphi, the oracle, the Sibyl, would never have informed you about this stuff. And Oedipus was this guy was supposed to die a long time ago, and he was never supposed to reach the tripleus of aCiPhitTh in the first place. And then the king, Laius on the throne, is like, yeah, well, wait a minute, like even if we defeat him, and keep our throne, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about the Sphinx? And he says, well, we'll go over the instructions, for dealing with the Sphinx. He says, didn't Tiresias already, give you instructions to provide the assistants, the assassins that were supposed to go, murder Oedipus on the road? He says, yeah. He says, but I've forgotten most of them. And he said, well, we'll go over it. We'll go over it, and I'll throw in a few more. I'll throw in a few more solutions, and I've got a riddle of my own that I want to tell you. But before that, I would talk about Oedipus. And he's like, okay, so Tiresias is fake news. He says, and the only reason that Oedipus, wins in this fight is because he cheats, right? And then David, goes back to Trump, and he says, and they come up with all these ridiculous things. And this right-wing media that emerges in this early part of the 21st century, that produces these, these myths and these stories and these delusions and these fantasies, like that all there's a conspiracy of voting machines, like there's a conspiracy of machines, and they're influencing the vote, and then they recount the vote, and they recount it once, and David moves his hands up and down for every time they recount the vote. So we're a little off here in our synchrony, but they recount the vote once. In Arizona, he says, they recount all the votes once, and then it turns out that Biden won, and so they recount them again. It turns out that Biden won, so they recount them again. Turns out that Biden won, so they recount them again. Turns out that Biden won, but this is where Laius is at, right? It's like, you died at the crossroads. Oh, go back, change it. Go back in time and change it. What are you going to do? And it's like, well, why? And the Oedipus on the throne is like thinking, yeah, because if I send the assassins, to kill this guy at the crossroads, they could screw it up. They could screw it up. And besides that, it appeals. This is what Tiresias understands, David says, and he slows down a bit. This is what Tiresias understands about Laius, right? It appeals to Laius' ego to be the one responsible, right, for the death of Oedipus, not someone else. He doesn't want to send someone else to do it. He wants to take the credit. It appeals to his narcissism. It appeals to his narcissism to be undefeatable. It appeals to his narcissism to be the one who destroys the stranger at the crossroads, even though he knows he's no longer a stranger. All right. So the Oedipus, the future Oedipus from the dream, it says, look, the only reason that Oedipus reason that Oedipus beats you in the first place, right, is because he cheats, and this is how he cheats. And then this Laius describes how. And David said, and this is well depicted. This is well depicted and documented in Pasolini's version of the cinematic version that Pasolini presents of this encounter between Laius and his entourage, and and Oedipus. And in fact, this is the way that he wins in this cinematic representation. He says, and it's recounted here. This is recounted here for the first time in Aristophanes. And in Aristophanes is where Pasolini gets this idea from. And he says, and Laius in the chariot says, look, this is how he wins. You're in the chariot. You got your entourage. Everybody's got weapons. This guy has no weapons. How is he gonna defeat us? Right? Okay. So this is what he does. He runs, and in spite of the fact that he's a clubfoot, in spite of the fact that he has this limp and he's kind of lame, he's a really good runner. I don't know how it is, but he's a really good runner. So he runs, and then everybody chases him, and we've got all this heavy armor on, right? He says we got all this heavy armor on, and we're chasing this guy, and we get tired. And one after another of us gets tired. And as soon as this one gets tired, and it's hot, it's summer, Aristophanes David says that this is funny because Aristophanes puts this in the dialogue. He says, nobody mentions in Sophocles that this happened in summer, but it's in summer. And that gets a laugh from the audience because it's calling attention, to the fictional framework in which the narrative is placed. And so it's so it's summer and it's hot, and we're wearing this armor and we're getting chafed and we're getting tired and we're getting mild heat sickness and we drop to our knees, and then as soon as that happens he comes back, and because he's hardly wearing anything. He's just like in those vase paintings where he's naked and talking to the Sphinx or whatever he's doing, and he's dressed much better for the weather and for these runs, in the hot sun, and he returns, and at that point, he picks up a stick or a rock or whatever, and he crushes our heads, and that's how he wins. But that's cheating, and he has this strategy, but it's cheating. It's just don't do that. Don't chase him. That's how you beat him. That's how you're going to beat him. And he says, and if you send those, and the future Laius says, if you send those assassins, like Tiresias, did Tiresias tell you, to send them naked? And then, the Laius on the throne wearing the crown, he thinks about it. He said, he didn't say anything about being naked. Yeah. And then the Laius, in the chariot says, yeah, he didn't say anything about being naked. And at that point, the character beside him, Kolemos, right? Hearing naked, he takes off all his clothes. He's still looking for the Tripleus Amaxtoas, but he takes off all his clothes and throws him out on the side of the chariot. And so he's naked in the chariot. And then the Laius in the chariot looks at him and rolls his eyes. It's like, we're just talking here, and there is no Oedipus, in this dream, he says to Kolemos. But Kolemos doesn't get it, and he remains naked, for the rest of the scene. So, David points out, how that gets a big laugh, and then for the most part, the Laius in the chariot and the Laius on the throne, have to ignore, Kolemos, for the rest of that scene. But Kolemos, continues to look for the Tripleus Amaxtoas as this dialogue unfolds. All right, so he says, yeah, Tiresias didn't tell you, did he? David says, but in the script, in the dialogue, it says Tiresias didn't tell you, did they? And then Laius says, no, they didn't. And he's starting to think that the future Laius, has a pretty good plan, and he's starting to see the advantages of encountering Oedipus on his own, and he's starting to play into the self-deceptive, right, rhetoric, and the self-deceptive plot, that was, and one could say, weaving in a certain way, or fashioning, that was designed by Tiresias to, one could say, encourage, perhaps, whether whether Tiresias knew that that Morpheus would send, Laius, the future Laius, to himself or not. He seemed to be aware that that he would be unable to admit defeat. It's just, David says, and it's just like what we can predict in 2022. So these figures like Mitch McConnell, in the Senate, and others. And then there's this other guy whose name begins with an M, just like all those Marys, McCarthy, he says, and there's these guys in the Senate and the House, right, that are running the he says, Mitch McConnell is the Senate, minority leader at this point, and McCarthy is, putting in a bid for House majority leader, but Speaker of the House, but he says, like, they know the psychology of this guy Donald Trump, right, and they know that he's already, like, flying in the face of the facts, he's already refused to admit defeat. They understand that it's the psychological character of this guy to be unable to accept defeat. And they know that if the 2020, in the 2024 election, David says, they know that if this guy runs, it's going to be the same thing all over again. There's no possible way that it can be any different than it was at the end of 2020 and at the outset of 2021 on January 6th. There's no way it can be any different, because he's already claiming in December, he entered the race at the beginning of December, David says. He gets that wrong, because he gets his future memory a little mixed up, because Donald Trump actually announced, right, that he was going to be a part of this, presidential election 2024 in November. And it's a mistake, and we've already explained, like, how future memory works and why these errors are bound to occur. But he says, at the beginning of December, right, he made this claim. He's going to enter the race. And then already, even before the middle of December, he's already demanding that he be reinstated in 2022, and that they throw out the elections. And there's no justification for it in any way, shape, or form. And he doesn't even ask for to redo the elections. And David laughs here, so we're right on target. He doesn't even ask, to redo the elections. He just says to be reinstated as a tyrant and throw out the Constitution, and make himself the tyrant of the United States of America. He says, and blatantly, like, writes, this, and then he goes back and explains social media again and what Twitter is and all this nonsense. And how figures like Elon Musk are, like, facilitating all of this, right? Like, it's not only politicians like McCarthy and McConnell that facilitate all this. It's people making money in any way they can in social media and other domains that facilitate, like, this madness. And he says, so these people, they already know. He's already claiming that he's the king, and he wants to go back and change the past, and never mind about the facts. And never mind about the Constitution. And yet, he says, here these same people are, and they're going to let him run. They're going to let him run full well knowing that if he doesn't win, that he's going to incite another insurrection. Full well knowing all of this. There's no way they don't know this. And he says, and Tiresias, like, understands. He understands the psychology. He understands the psychology of this tyrant at Laius so well that he knows that if he presents the facts in this way and pretends to be, that he pretends, to be protecting Laius, but protecting Laius in these subtle ways that suggest defeat, right, and his own vulnerability, that he won't be able to handle the image of such a vulnerability, and he'll have to react against it. Some part of his consciousness or unconscious mind will rebel against the idea of failure and defeat. And that he'll send himself, right? He'll send himself out into the field of battle, and destroy himself. And this is precisely what's occurring here, because Tiresias gets it right. Because Tiresias understands precisely, who and what Laius is. He can fashion, right? He can fashion the dreams and the stories of the dreams in a way that influence the outcome of the future. And that outcome, might not be exactly what, Tiresias imagined it to be. And David is using, he here throughout. And probably because, he's thinking of Tiresias as motivated by these kinds of deeds of heroism that he associates with masculinity. But we can say, throughout they may not realize, the outcome of the events in exactly the way that they intend to. But he says, nevertheless, right, their understanding of psychology and character and the depth to which, through which they understand the motivations of Laius, help inform their strategies of deception, that influence the outcome of the future. And the story that David says, the story that Laius is providing, the future Laius, in the chariot, is providing, to the king on the throne, is having an effect, and he's really determined now, to go and make this encounter with this character who was once a stranger and who now has become Oedipus. And so he's listening and he's attending. And he says, "Well, okay, that's great." He says, "Okay, so I'll go naked, and I'll take some helpers with me, and we'll all go naked, and we'll encounter Oedipus on the road, and we won't chase after him. We'll just pick up some rocks and throw them at him maybe and knock him over. And it sounds like a good strategy, but how am I going to deal with this things? I can't remember all." He says, David spreads out. I can't remember all of those solutions to the riddles. And then the future Laius says, "I tell you what, it's like, this is Greece. We have writing implements, we have tools. Write it down. Don't try to commit it to memory. Don't play the part, right? Don't play the part of the epic storyteller." And David, laughs because he's making reference to himself, and the orality and the verbal, memory. He's like, write it down on a piece of paper, He says, pretend that, you belong to the muse Graphia, that we have writing, we have prose. Don't be the epic hero, he says, and then David laughs. And so here, so within the dream, right? Within the dream, the Laius in the chariot reaches into his pocket and pulls out a piece of paper or whatever it is that they write on, a scroll, or it's probably a wax tablet, right? And some kind of a device that inscribes on this tablet, and he hands it to the Laius on this road. Like, take these notes. All right. So he says, so if she asks you, who has 4 legs in the morning, who has two legs in the afternoon, and who has 3 legs in the evening, then say an ordinary human. If she asks you who has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 0 legs in the evening, say a king. If she asks you who has 16 legs in the morning, 6 legs in the afternoon, and 0 legs in the evening, say a moss. If she asks you who has 16 legs in the morning, 0 legs in the afternoon, and 6 legs in the evening, say a butterfly. If she asks you who has 0 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 4 legs in the evening, say a frog. If she asks you, this is a tricky one, he says, David, he says, the Laius in the chariot says, this is a tricky one. Don't forget this one. He says, I had plenty of practice and experience with this one. So if she asks you, who has 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs in the afternoon, and 2 legs in the evening, say a dog twice run over by a chariot. If she asks you, who has 0 legs in the morning, 6 legs in the afternoon, and 0 legs in In the evening, say, a fly tortured by a naughty boy. And here's another tricky one. If she asks you, who has 0 legs in the morning, who has 0 legs in the afternoon, and who has 0 legs in the evening, and be sure you write this down exactly as I say it. Exactly as I say it. Then you say, an amoeba who doesn't understand cellular content and membrane displacement metaphorically. You got that? And the Laius on the throne, nods his head. Yes, I understand that. And here's another thing. Here's another thing that Tiresias didn't tell you. I bet Tiresias didn't tell you this. And then David says, did she? But we'll say, did they? I bet Tiresias didn't tell you this, did they? David says that the Laius in the chariot says to the Laius on the throne. And he says, I bet Tiresias didn't tell you that that you play this game. You play this game with the Sphinx. And it's not a one question thing. If you get the answer to this riddle right, you think you got it made. No, then you got to give her a riddle. And if she gets that riddle right, then she's going to ask you another riddle, and you're gonna play this game out until one of you gets the riddle wrong, and the cards are stacked in her favor because riddles are what she does. She's got those fishing baskets. And then the audience laughs because of the reference to the fishing baskets, and the Laius on the throne just looks confused because he doesn't have access to that expression, the gryphos, as riddle. He's thinking in terms of enigmas and enigmatas. He's like, I don't get what you're talking about with the fishing basket. He's like, that's another riddle. I'm gonna tell you the riddle of the fishing basket. He tells him like the riddle of the fishing basket and several other ones. And Laius is writing all these down, diligently writing all these down. He says, but the Laius in the chariot, he says, but you need a really good riddle of your own because, even if you guess all of her riddles, then you're going to have to come up with one that's going to defeat her. And Tiresias didn't tell you that. And David says, did she? But we say, did they? And the Laius on the throne, shakes his head. No, they didn't tell us that. No, they didn't tell me that. No, maybe they use they, but not in the same way that Tiresias uses they, but maybe they use the royal they, the royal we as the royal they. No, they didn't tell us that. Maybe they say that. And so the Laius on the throne said, well, what riddle could you possibly have that's going to defeat the Sphinx? And he says, it's very simple. The Laius in the chariot says, it's very simple. It's very simple. And then I'll leave. And this will be the end of the dream. And then you can go on to Act 2, Scene 2, on your way to Delos toward Delphi at the Tripleus of Moxitois. And as he says, Tripleus of Moxitois, then of course, Kolemos, picks that up, looks up, his eyes get bright again. He gets all excited. He looks around, and he's looking around furiously for the Tripleus of Moxitois that they're already at, right? But that the Laius in the chariot is referring to the real Tripleus of Moxitois, not the one in the dream. That Laius is going to engage, right, in Act 2, Scene 2, in the analipsy that represents, his undertaking, as an effort, to destroy, Oedipus on his own and take the credit, right, for what he's already lost, because he's already been defeated, just like Donald Trump in 2020, but still can't put it down, right? And he's going to do it all over again. He's going to repeat the same thing all over again, David says. All right, so she says, whatever riddle she gives you, these are your answers. You got them all written down. Take this with you. Take this, put a piece of paper in your pocket, he says, or put this wax tablet in your pants, or whatever, or wear it around your neck, or whatever. Do whatever you need to do with this information, but make sure you have it with you. Make sure you have it with you so that you can answer these riddles, and make sure that you do it in a sly way so that the Sphinx can't tell that you're reading it. He says, and then David says, so imagine I had a prompter, behind the audience, and I wasn't really performing this, I wasn't doing the work of the epic poet or the work of Melite. Imagine that I was just reading a text, where would I have it? Like, well, in this case, I'd have to have some kind of a prompter, behind the audience. He says, like, that's not going on here, he says, but imagine that it was, right? Now, if I didn't have a prompter, like I got stuck and I had to remember something, what would I do? And he puts his arms out. What would I do? Well, I'd have to have some secret way of like writing it on my hand, or keeping it on a little piece of paper in my pocket. Maybe I have like maybe I had a prompter in the audience that like would give me little hand signals and stuff. Anyway, so the Laius in the chariot, is providing Laius, on the throne with all these different ways that he might be able to hide his wax tablet or his piece of paper in his pocket if he gets stuck. And there's like gestures you can make, that you put your hands up, like as if you're expressing something, but really, like you're looking at what's written on the back of your thumb. David says, like, suppose I had stuff written on the back of my thumb, and out of my peripheral vision, right? I'm reading off my hands here, and so there it is. No one really can see that, right? And so the Laius in the chariot is giving him all kinds of advice on how to perform this, secretly. And then he says, but this one you should memorize. He says the one that have these answers written out and try to remember what you can. But if you can't, you have a backup. But this one you should really memorize. This is your riddle. And the Oedipus on the throne says, what riddle could I possibly give the Sphinx that you wouldn't be able to guess? He says, and the Oedipus in the chariot says, sorry, I said Oedipus. I think I just said Oedipus twice. This is a breaking out of David's character. He doesn't get this wrong. He refers to Laius as Laius throughout. I for some reason I got distracted. I guess, the story is so complex in a certain way, or remembering it's not that the story is really complex, but remembering the details of the story and how they unfold and the way that they unfold, it requires a lot of memory. And so, I don't know, I let it slip. Or maybe it's a Freudian slip, and it'd be an interesting Freudian slip, like wanting Oedipus to slip out of Laius, right? So what kind of slip is involved? And this is not David narrating this because he didn't make the error, but I made the error. What kind of slip is involved in getting Laius's name, wrong, incorrectly, and saying Oedipus in place of Laius? What kind of Oedipal Freudian slip is that? It's like a metapoetics of it's like a metapoetics of the Freudian slip, right? It's like a metapoetics of parapraxis, saying Oedipus for Laius. We almost need the ghost of Sigmund Freud, to step in here, or maybe Diarmenia. Diarmina hermeneuio, playing the part of, with a Sigmund Freud mask on to step in and interpret this parapraxis as a metapoetics of parapraxis. Anyway, Laius, Laius in the Chariot, had just offered all these different kinds of advice on like how to cheat, and have these cheat sheets in case Laius' memory fails him, and he can't remember the answers to all these complex riddles that all have the same form, right? They're all about legs. They're all about legs, and this is the whole point. The Laius in the Chariot is leading up to. The Sphinx has like all these riddles, and they look fancy, but they're only fancy because you've never heard all of them at one time. And you don't realize that she just repeats the same riddles, endlessly repeats the same riddles, and they're not as original and interesting as they appear at first. Like if you there at the Tripleus Amaxitoas, and you never heard one of these riddles before, it sounds pretty interesting and complex. But if you get that each one of the riddles has three parts, and it's always morning, afternoon, and evening, then it helps you to understand and conceptualize these riddles in a certain way and solve them. If you get that, right? And if you understand that they're all about legs, and that the answer to each one of these questions about legs, is some kind of different creature, then that also helps you to conceptualize these riddles and get the answer, right? So what appears complex and interesting at first isn't as complex and interesting as it really seems to be, once you've heard it, quite a few times, again and again and again and again, right? And you're always returning to that same place. You're always returning to Oedipus at the crossroads, and that's really the only part of the idea of Greek tragedy that you really understand. And you don't really only understand that in terms of Aristotle's reading of it, in terms of the way it's presented in Sophocles. You didn't get the rest of it. Anyway, David says, so then the Laius in the Chariot says this. So your riddle is going to be, a little bit different than that. Okay, you go ahead and utilize her structure. You utilize her through three-part structure, right? Use the morning part, right? Use the afternoon part, and use the evening part. Yeah, and the reason that you're going to do that, I'm explaining to you. The Laius in the Chariot says, I'm explaining to you the structure and the strategy of your riddle and why it's going to defeat the Sphinx. You get this? And the Laius on the throne says, yeah, I got it. You're explaining to me the structure and the strategy of the riddle and why it's going to defeat the Sphinx. Okay, first of all, he says, you've got this part. It's like morning, afternoon, and evening. So you set her up. She thinks it's about legs. She already is going to be thinking about legs, because all of her riddles that involve morning, afternoon, and evening are about legs. And if you set it up this way, her mind, you're going to affect like the way that she perceives the riddle. You're going to perform, right? You're going to perform a scaffolding. And then I'm going to step out of David's character here just a little bit. So we could use as an analogy, if David had understood, right? If David had understood the organization of the smile of the Sphinx in terms of the othisi, the analepsy, and the anavasi, and then we introduced a character that doesn't have, right, a knowledge development that corresponds to this three-part structure, we would have set him up, right, with a development, that with a pattern of development, right, and an understanding of a pattern of development that was a misdirection and led him in the wrong way, right? And you can think of that as an analogy, right? Well, anyway, let's go back. It says, okay, so this is, he's explaining, Laius in the Chariot, explaining why this riddle is going to work. So we set her up. We say, use the morning, afternoon, an evening thing. But then, you know, we're going to throw in a whole different thing that has nothing to do with anybody's legs. And so she's looking for these entities, right? Like, and it's all about legs. And then the cognitive dissonance, you know, or the rhetorical, you know, conundrum that we're going to produce here, you know, involves like getting our mind oriented toward like this kind of solution set, and then throwing in this whole like different, you know, type of riddle. Okay, and David's running out of time here, so I got to go back before we get that blue screen. Haven't really been paying attention to that. All right, so we're back on track with the representation of David here. All right, so this is a riddle, you know, Leia says. All right, you ask her this exactly in these words, and you want to memorize this one, because you don't want to forget this one, and that would really be bad, you know. Okay, this is important. It says, okay, so ask her this one: who is a stranger in the morning, my wife's husband in the afternoon, and my brother-in-law's niece's father in the evening? And then like Laius in the chair is really pleased with himself and smiles. And Laius on the throne is like, that's pretty complicated. And he's like, but he's getting it. It's like, yeah, that's Oedipus. That's Oedipus. Yeah. And Laius says, and the irony and the pleasure that you take in that one is that you know, in the original version of the story, the one that the Fates, you know, tell, Oedipus is responsible for the destruction of the Sphinx. So one way or another, you know, she can't answer that question. One way or another, even if she knew the answer to that question, she couldn't answer that question, right? So you won. You won, because even if she knew the answer like holds like her fate, her doom, her destruction, right? Because that's the way the story got told in Sophocles. And then everybody laughs in the audience because it's, again, breaking out of the rhetorical domain of the fiction and referring to something that they know as fiction, right? In their experience of the world. And so you know, the Laius on the throne, you know, shakes his head, you know, in agreement, nods his head in agreement. Motor signs for yes or no, as described and discussed in Roman Jakobson. And David, you know, points that out. And then Laius on the throne says, so is that all? And then the Laius in the chair says, what else do you need? You won. You won. You know, go back and win again. You know, you won. And then, you know, David returns, you know, to the connection, you know, between the self-deception of the future Laius and the willingness, you know, to be deceived by himself of the Laius before, like, the encounter with Oedipus at the Tripleus Amoxitoius, right? And returns to you know, that narcissistic you know, psychological function in Trump that refuses, you know, to accept defeat, and then, you know, also returns to the social responsibility of figures like McConnell and McCarthy, you know, who refuse to admit like the obviousness of the truth, which is if you let this guy run for president, you know, you're setting yourself up for an insurrection, right? And you're setting yourself up for constitutional failure, and you're setting yourself up, you know, essentially you're setting yourself up for the potentiality of a civil war in the United States, because it's like a you know, the Constitution is the immovable object, right? And Donald Trump is the force that is going to, you know, fail to concede, like to the authority of anything other than himself, right? And to any other future than the possibility, right, of his success, and therefore, you know, you're setting yourself up for total constitutional failure. You're setting yourself up, and there are always going to be some individuals who are going to refuse, right? Who are going to refuse to disavow the Constitution of the United States. Who are going to refuse, right, to turn their heads and accept, right? Accept the rise of fascism. And there are always going to be some, you know, who support the integrity of democracy. And therefore, if you allow such a king, such a tyrant, such a narcissist, such a fascist, right, to engage in what they are merely pretending, right, is the democratic process, and for them is always a foregone conclusion, right, because they already know that they've won, no matter what the results of the election. You know, because and the delusional architecture will always take them to a place, a ridiculous and absurd place, in which they can justify that. You know, outside of any evidence of truth whatsoever. So you're setting yourself up, you know, for constitutional failure and the potentiality of civil war. And that, you know, David says, you know, it is what the narrative stake in a storytelling such as this is. However, you know, fable-like or folktale-like or myth-like it appears on the surface. You know, the narrative aspect in terms of like our self-understanding and self-transformation and the possibility of change in one direction or another, you know, relates, you know, to the stakes of our relationship to our understanding of ourselves as democratic subjects, as citizens of the United States, as keepers of a certain kind of integrity and a certain kind of relationship to a set of values, right? And this is why, you know, stories like this, you know, are narrated, and storytellings like this are constructed. He says, so when we return, you know, David says, you know, we'll return to Act 2, Scene 2, and the encounter, you know, that takes place between Laius and Oedipus at Daulis toward Delphi, at the Tripleus of Moxitoius.